All right, hello everyone, and welcome back. Let's do a brief recap of where we left off on Monday. So, last lecture we introduced you all to the sociology of culture, and we discussed some pretty big picture ideas for how sociologists tend to think about culture. First, we learned the three different ways that sociologists have characterized culture. First, as a structure of symbols and meanings. Second, as a set of practices. And then finally, as a toolkit. We then discussed the concept of cultural capital, and we explored how we can think of culture as part of the causal pathway through which social inequality is created and reproduced. In today's lecture, we are going to do a bit of a deeper dive into some specific questions and topics within the sociology of culture. Specifically, we're going to discuss the media and the role that media plays in affecting our wider democratic culture. So let's jump right in. In the last lecture, I put up 3 approaches to culture that were discussed in the textbook. I put those up on the slides, and I mentioned that we were going to save this last one for today's lecture. So let's return to that right now. So just as culture can be studied as a set of symbols, or culture can be studied as a set of learned practices and cultural skills, we can also study culture as communication. Now, importantly, we study culture as a shared form of communication because what's important here is that language and the culture that we produce using language is this kind of joint production. Just as no individual can have his or her own language, that is, language is a form of communication between and across individuals, no individual can have his or her own culture. To highlight this interactive social aspect of language and communication, sociologists and communication scholars will sometimes refer to what is known as mass communication. Mass communication is just a way of differentiating that kind of interaction and discussion that occurs at a large-scale societal level, and distinguishing that from that kind of communication that occurs between individuals, like in a conversation. So, for instance, you might juxtapose a conversation that happens on Twitter that a bunch of people can see and participate in from a conversation between friends. So the former being more of mass communication. Okay, so right now you might be thinking, okay, this distinction makes sense, but why focus on mass communication at a societal level? What's so important about those kinds of conversations? So one account of the importance of mass communication comes from the political philosopher Jürgen Habermas. Habermas is a German philosopher and one of the most important political theorists living today. One of his central ideas is about the importance of the public sphere. So you can think of the public sphere as a place where private citizens can come together for a discussion on topics of general interest and of general importance. So Habermas's general idea is that the existence of a healthy public sphere, that is, healthy public discussion, is essential for democracy. He argued that the state of democracy could be measured by the life and the quality of the public sphere. So, for example, in a country with a flourishing public sphere, citizens should be able to associate and to assemble freely. They should be able to express their opinions freely. Habermas argued that this free exchange is crucial to legitimating any government. So Habermas's idea of the public sphere is grounded in actually in 18th century English coffee houses. So prior to the 18th century, in feudal society, Habermas argued that there was no clear or crisp distinction between public and private life. But by the time you had the 18th century, social life began to be slowly transformed. Feudal institutions disappeared, the population was urbanizing, and increasingly individuals' private lives were distinguished from their status as citizens. Habermas argued that the first public sphere was really a bourgeois public sphere, a group of middle-class people who suddenly had the time and the ability to engage in debate and conversation about politics. This culture of public discussion emerged in coffee houses or salons or literary societies. The press and other forms of media, like pamphlets, were also an important part of this early public sphere, as these new forms of media became the primary means by which individuals could communicate their ideas to a wider audience. While the origins of the public sphere were in the bourgeoisie, Habermas argues that there was an ideal public sphere that should be accessible to all, regardless of their class position. Habermas argued that what creates the public sphere is not class identities, but rather kind of a general communitarian will that exists across classes to discuss issues that are of interest and importance to everyone. Because of this, Habermas argues that the success of the public sphere depends on several key factors. In an ideal public sphere, citizens should be treated as equal, all equally free to express their opinions and to have those opinions heard by their fellow citizens. Furthermore, everyone should be able to access the public sphere. So it's not really a public sphere if it remains limited to bourgeois organizations, for example. And importantly for Habermas, a public sphere should be a place where there can be deliberation. A public sphere isn't just a place where people shout their opinions into a void. Instead, deliberation implies a kind of engagement. It's a back and forth between individuals who are willing to consider new points of view. So you say what you think, I say what I think, and that's a deliberative conversation. Thus, debate was supposed to be ideally rational. When rational and motivated citizens engage in this kind of deliberation, the thought was the strongest ideas and the arguments should win the day. Now, it's important to note that Habermas's idea of a public sphere is both normative as well as objective. So by normative, I mean the public sphere is an idea that tells us how things ought to be, how we should organize a public sphere. It's an ideal that doesn't quite ever exist. And by objective, I mean we can also treat the public sphere as a real entity. So there is a public sphere, but that public sphere may fall far short of the idealized public sphere that animates Habermas's theory. You might make the same kind of distinction of there's an idealized version of democracy, and then there's the democracy in which we live. So we can deal with that word and that concept as an ideal, and we can deal with kind of the objective reality of it. Okay, so at this point, you should be thinking about how the public sphere operates in our own society today. How similar and how different is it from the public sphere of Habermas's theory? So you might ask, for instance, in what ways does our news media encourage high-quality, rational conversation? And to what degree does our news media really effectively present us with different ideas? And in what ways do our platforms that allow citizens to voice their opinions lead to deliberation and reflection and quiet, rational thought? So these might be some questions for you to consider in our recitation section. What's the quality of contemporary public conversation? But to explore some of these questions a little further, one of the reasons that people were first really excited when social media came onto the scene was that they thought this new media was going to be better at approximating an idealized public sphere than did the old media. So you can think of old media as things like television, public radio, print media. And these kinds of old media, you typically had news, opinions, and information mediated through professionals, like journalists or news broadcasters. So citizens weren't speaking directly to one another, as in this idealized public sphere, but they were rather presented with what one another thought through the kind of mediated lens of journalists. New media, by contrast, promised to be something different. New media, that is digital media, tends to be more accessible and more democratic. So you can think of blogs or podcasts, right? Anyone can start a blog. And as many internet memes joke, it seems like almost everyone has a podcast these days. Through digital delivery of news media, it's easier for regular individuals to present content that they themselves make. Rather than relying on a mediator like a news journalist to tell you what suburban voters in Ohio are thinking, for instance, you can simply find their blogs or listen to their podcasts and see what they say for themselves. So the question is, has new media lived up to these expectations? Has it delivered on this promise? So there's been a fair number of critiques of new media. that it doesn't always live up to those attributes that were supposed to make it closer to the public sphere than what we've seen in the case of old media. These critiques are, first, new media might not actually be as inclusive as it has the potential to be. Second, new media may appear to be democratic, with everyone owning their own blog, but actually technology and social media firms have been consolidating, exercising a greater degree of control over their markets. And third, maybe the quality of discussion, maybe it falls short of that idealized rational conversation that Habermas imagined. Okay, so let's go through these critiques one by one. So first, is social media actually inclusive? Well, let's break down who uses social media in the United States today. And we'll start with an obvious divide, age. This graph shows the percentage of American adults who use at least one social media site by their age group. The dark blue line represents people between the ages of 18 and 29. And as you can see here, during the first decade of the 2000s, it was really this younger cohort of people who were taking up the use of social media sites. But since then, we've seen the rise of older groups also engage in social media. By 2019, for instance, about 90% of people aged 18 to 29 use social media. About 80% of those aged 30 to 49 use social media. This percentage begins to drop, however, as you go up these age brackets. Among those who are 65 plus, only about 35% report using one social media site a day. Okay, what about usage by race? Interestingly, here we see a fair degree of inclusivity by race, with about 70 to 75% of whites, blacks, and Hispanics reporting using a social media site. All right, now what about that urban-rural divide? Well, here we definitely see evidence that individuals who live in rural areas seem to use social media at lower rates than their urban counterparts, about 60% compared to 70%. And this probably doesn't surprise you, but wealthy individuals use social media more than those who are more working class. Here we see that while about 80% of individuals making $75,000 or more a year report using social media, that number is more like 55% for those earning less than $30,000 a year. So you might ask yourself, what do you think of all these numbers? Does this represent to you an inclusive new media? Does this represent progress in terms of inclusivity from old media or not? Do you view these numbers positively, or is there some work to be done? Now, remember that for Habermas, the ideal of the public sphere was that it was a public space. It wasn't controlled by government because that would stifle speech. But for Habermas, an ideal world, neither would it be controlled by private companies. Instead of being governmental or private, the public sphere is meant, as in its name, to be public. But what about the public sphere as it is actually instantiated in America today? Who controls media? So this is an infographic I particularly love because it illustrates that while the new media in America has always been controlled by companies, that control has been consolidating in recent decades. In 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 companies. However, if you fast forward 30 years to 2011, the same 90% of media is controlled by only 6 companies. So this is pretty astounding. And it should make you think about what we learned last week about inequality in markets and about superstar firms, right? So at this point, you might be wondering, just 6 firms? But I can name more than 6 television channels right off the top of my head. Well, many of the television networks that you know are controlled by one of these big 6 companies. So you're probably already aware that News Corp, for example, owns both the Wall Street Journal, Fox, and the New York Post. But you might not have known that GE, General Electric, also owns Comcast, NBC, and Universal Pictures, or that Disney owns ABC. So why does this consolidation matter? Well, remember that part of the point of the public sphere was that a diversity of viewpoints and ideas should be put forward. You might think that it's harder to get a diversity of opinions when only a few organizations act as gatekeepers into the media landscape. Oftentimes in business, new ideas or new ways of doing or seeing things are introduced by new competitors or small new companies. What does it mean for media organizations that such a small number of firms control so much here? So among the big firms like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, the scene doesn't look much better. This graph shows the number of acquisitions by these firms by years. That means the number of times these firms bought smaller companies. What you can see here is that part of the reason Amazon, Facebook, and Google have stayed on top is through purchasing smaller companies. Sometimes these smaller companies are just companies that give them tools for their own developers. So it's like buying a hammer, buying a screwdriver. But other times, these acquisitions are communication apps or new small companies with technology that have the potential to grow into a possible competitor. So some of these acquisitions are a way of purchasing potential future competitors. So now let's get into that third critique, the quality of discussion on social media. Recall that part of the promise and the potential of social media is that it amplifies voices that you wouldn't hear otherwise. But who actually participates in social media discussion? So this is a graphic I particularly love that illustrates who makes up Twitter, and particularly who generates content on Twitter. So let's pretend for a second that Twitter was composed of 100 people. Well, about 20 of them would be dead. That is just empty accounts doing nothing. And about 50 would not be saying anything at all over the course of a week. Of the remaining 30 who do tweet something in a given week, only 5 would have more than 500 followers. And 75% of the whole content generated by these 100 people would come from 5 people. So how is that for a public sphere? Okay, so given this uneven media environment, we might ask, what effect does social media have on democratic discussion? Are these 30 who tweet once a week at least having a good conversation? Are those 5 generating content leading to better public sphere than we would have otherwise? So to get at this question, we are going to do a deep dive into one of the readings for today's class, a short article about the effect of Twitter on political polarization. This article was written by a sociologist at Duke University, Chris Bale, and a set of his collaborators. So Chris Bale does very interesting work on political polarization and media deliberation. And so if you're interested in this paper, I really highly encourage you to check out his website for other work. Also, the central question that Bale asks in this paper is, does being on Twitter and being exposed to different views increase or does it decrease polarization? Remember that for Habermas, a key feature of the public sphere was high quality deliberation, where the underlying idea is that talking with others about different ideas and even disagreeing with those ideas is a necessary component of a democracy. So what happens when someone's presented with an idea on Twitter that they don't agree with? Well, this paper tests several hypotheses about what could happen. The first hypothesis is based on something called intergroup contact theory. The general idea is that when someone is exposed to opposing views or people who think differently than them, that this generates empathy, maybe even consensus. The general background idea is that exposure to differing views or individuals limits negative sentiments against those views or those groups of people. Okay, so that's hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2. On the other hand, you could instead imagine what's called a backfire effect. A backfire effect is a theory that has emerged from several psychology studies that's essentially based on motivated reasoning. That is, when we find something that we don't like, we might come up with a bunch of reasons about why we don't like it. And at the end of the day, after we've come up with all these new reasons why we don't like it, we have even more reasons to disagree with the view than we would have had before. We probably have an even stronger resistance to the disagreement than we would have before we knew about the idea. So when you hear an idea that you don't like, you might experience what is known as cognitive dissonance. Your brain comes up with reasons that this idea is bad and wrong and dumb. And even if you never had any opinions about that idea in the past, backfire effects lead you to dislike it. Okay, so both of those theories are rooted in general psychological tendencies. And these should apply to both Republicans and Democrats alike, right? These are general psychological traits. They should affect Republicans and Democrats. Anyone introduced to a new idea should either build empathy on the one hand, like hypothesis 1, or they should experience a backfire effect, like hypothesis 2, depending on which hypothesis you think is more likely. But Bale and his colleagues also raise another option, one based on asymmetric polarization. This is a theory based on political science as well as cultural sociology research that suggests that liberals and conservatives may react differently to new information. First, there's research from cultural sociology that discusses differences in the values that Republicans and Democrats might hold. For instance, diversity for Democrats tends to be held as a really important, strong value. So perhaps Democrats might be more likely to be open to new ideas, if it's the case that they privilege ideological diversity, for example. If diversity is very important, maybe new ideas can fit under that value. Apart from a values-based approach, literature and political science has shown that asymmetric polarization is a feature of political leaders. So this graph here shows the distribution of DW nominate scores over time, which is just a measure of how far left or how far right the two parties have been based on their voting records and political positions. What you can see here is that between 1960 and today, the parties have moved further apart. That's political polarization. You've probably heard of this. You probably already know about it. But what's key here is that most of this polarization is driven by the Republican Party moving further to the right on these DW nominate scores. So if Twitter users take their cues from their political leaders, they might also experience similar asymmetric polarization, moving further to the right when presented with political views with which they disagree. So how do Bale and his colleagues test these theories? Well, they conduct an experiment on Twitter. They got 800 Republicans and 800 Democrats to participate in an online study, an online experiment. For half of the users in both groups, they are asked to follow a bot, so like a computer program, that's going to tweet out 24 messages a day. But people are not told what the content of the bot's messages would be. Over time, they get the bot that Republican users are seeing to retweet messages from major Democratic Party politicians. So if you're in this Republican group here, about half of those 800 people get the experimental treatment. And that experimental treatment is that they are being exposed to Democratic Party tweets. And same with the other side. If you're in this Democratic group, of that 800, half of them get this experimental treatment where they are exposed to Republican Party tweets. So each side is exposed to tweets that they might not be likely to see otherwise. Okay, so users in both groups are treated with a bot condition. They're being shown at least 24 messages a day from accounts they probably haven't seen before. And also note that there's a control group in both cases. So you need a control group for the experiment. So then what happens? To see the effects of being exposed to the bot's messages over time, Bale and his colleagues gave the Twitter users a test at the beginning and at the end of the experiment to see whether their views had changed. This test is called an ideological consistency scale. And it basically measures the degree to which respondents hold left or right-leaning views. To give you a sense of this here are some questions from the scale. Questions like, Stricter environmental laws and regulations cost too many jobs and hurt the economy. Do you agree or disagree? Government regulation of business is necessary to protect the public interest. Do you agree or disagree? Poor people today have it easy because they can get government benefits without having to do anything in return. Do you agree or disagree? And immigrants today strengthen our country because of their hard work and talents. Do you agree or disagree? Okay, so what was the result from running this experiment, exposing these Twitter users to these different bot conditions? All right. So, well, if you look at the Democrats in the sample, not too much have changed. So if we look at this first row here, starting from the top down, this is the effect of the treatment on all respondents who were assigned to that bot, around those 400. As you can see, that line, that little blue line, it overlaps with 0, meaning that there was basically 0 effect. And even if you get more strict, looking just at all the people who really closely followed the bot, you can see that, like at the bottom when it says fully compliant respondents, these are people who really closely followed the bot, who every time they were asked a question about the bot, knew what the bot had been tweeting. They were very attentive, in other words. No matter kind of which subsample you look at, there didn't seem to be much of an effect. However, look at the difference among Republican respondents. Here we see that no matter how closely the respondents were following the bot, they become more conservative over time. Those that were fully compliant and following all the bots became the most conservative of all. Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, well, this seems bad. Twitter is driving political polarization. Is social media ruining our society? So I included another reading for today from the sociologist Zeynep Tufekci that offers a more sanguine take on how social media is affecting us today. In this piece entitled Social Media's Small Positive Role in Human Relationships, Tufekci argues that some of the doom and gloom about how social media is affecting us might be overstated. She argues that you need to consider the counterfactual. That is, what would people be doing if they weren't using social media? And she suggests that rather than connecting with people on Facebook, people might just be watching TV. And that there's something more communitarian about social media than these realistic alternatives. So as you'll note, this article was written in 2012. So you might ask yourself, how has this held up? Do I agree with this article or not? Well, you might note that since 2012, when this article was written, social media use has climbed steadily upwards. This graph presents results from a survey that tracked people aged 18 and above and their digital media use over time. That is, how often did they access social media apps or web pages or videos? The yellow bars is how long people spend on their phone, and the green is how much they access social media through their computers or desktops. So as you can see in 2012, since 2012, the number of hours that people spend on social media has climbed up nearly 2 hours a day more than it was about 8 years ago. At the same time, reports from teens themselves tend to say that social media actually allows them to feel connected to their friends. So about 81% say that they feel more connected to what's going on in their friends' lives due to social media. 71% say social media lets them be creative. Although about half, 45%, do report that that there's a lot of drama on social media, drama that might even be emotionally overwhelming. Similarly, teens report that social media makes them feel included and confident more often than they report that it makes them feel excluded or insecure. So 71% say it makes them feel included, as opposed to 25% saying that it makes them feel excluded. And 69% say it makes them feel confident, as opposed to 26% saying that it makes them feel insecure. It's important to note here that some recent research does push back on these self-reports, linking Facebook to increased depression, for instance. One thing that you might talk about in recitation might be, what do you think about these self-reports about social media use for young adults? How much did you find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with Zainab's argument? Okay, to summarize, in this class, we've covered the concept of culture as communication, and we examined the notion of the public sphere and asked how, as an ideal, it applies to our own contemporary media environment. And we examined questions about the social media's impact on democratic discourse. Next week, we are going to take a deeper dive into some of these political themes when we spend an entire week discussing power, politics, and the government. I'll see you all then.